Hey everybody, welcome back to History Student Reacts. Today we'll be watching Voices of the Peninsular War by Epic History. Now, I believe the premise of this video is that we're going to be hearing stories taken from primary sources of people who were present during the Peninsular War. This is a very primary source-focused video, which I really like because ideally it puts us a little closer to the history, to the people who were around at the time, so I'm pretty excited to get into it. But before we do, I would appreciate it if you guys would leave a like, subscribe, and check out my Patreon, which is linked down below. Now with all of that out of the way, let's jump right into this reaction. Alright, there's your content warning at the beginning. We got some brutal stuff ahead, unsurprisingly. Uh-oh. You do not want that remedy.
In 1808, French Emperor Napoleon Bonaparte launched a war against Spain.
Napoleon of the perspective that he could bring liberty and good governance wherever he went. Now, Napoleon did broadly bring sort of modern-style governance wherever he went, but that didn't mean that the people in those places actually wanted it, right? It's one of those things where, you're the big empire coming into all of these other countries, invading them, and saying, I'm bringing you liberty. And it's like, look, even if you've got some good ideas, and Napoleon had some good ideas and some bad ones, I'm not sure the locals are going to love you bringing those ideas in at the tip of a bayonet.
Until then, one of France's closest allies. But Napoleon saw a country that was backward, in thrall to its priests, and ruled by an incompetent, dissolute monarchy.
And, the thing is, Spain was a pretty conservative country at this point. Perhaps more conservative and traditional than a lot of its European neighbors. Now, that can be overstated. Because, in the couple of years preceding this, we'd had the Bourbon reforms. There had been some reform within the Spanish Empire and Spain itself. Things were advancing. It's not like time was at a standstill. But it was comparatively a little more conservative than some of its neighbors. And I think, if you had talked to, at least a certain amount of Spanish people, maybe those who were more educated, those in the middle class, they probably would have told you, yeah, I don't love how things are being run. However, when Napoleon comes in and he says, I'm here to do things better, there was a very both nationalist and religious reaction to Napoleon because, first of all, there were a lot of Spaniards who were perfectly fine with how things were. A lot of, peasants who loved their government and their religion and all that stuff. But even those who perhaps weren't super satisfied, they certainly didn't want the French coming in, who they felt were very radical and atheistic and frightening. And of course, the French were very radical compared to a lot of their neighbors. The Spaniards felt threatened. They felt their religion was at threat, their country was at threat, their institutions, and, in some ways, they were right. The French were known for marching around and tearing down these old traditional institutions. And so, the people of Spain, and of course Portugal is also a part of this, they decided to fight back.
He intended to sweep away these corrupt institutions and bestow upon Spain the benefits of Napoleonic rule. Reform, modernization, efficient government.
Right, and like I said, you look at the history of Spain, and you'll see both before and especially after this war is over, there will be liberals within Spain over time struggling for good governance, modern bureaucracy. That is something that a lot of people did want, but they didn't want it the way Napoleon was giving it to them, and they didn't want to get it from the French.
The Spanish people, pious and loyal, reacted with fury. The result was a savage war that lasted nearly 6 years, costing 500,000 lives and helping to bring down Napoleon's empire.
Yeah.
For the Spanish, it was their war of independence.
Oh, wow.
For their British allies,
their war of independence, while around this same time and afterwards, a lot of the Spanish colonies will begin fighting their wars of independence against Spain, against the metropole. So, we've got a lot of wars of independence going on in this era. But yeah, this would be a bloody and long conflict. Now, it wasn't, or at least I don't think, it was the main thing that brought Napoleon down. Even if you just look at the numbers, his incursion into Russia was far more harmful to Napoleon than the Peninsular War was. But the Peninsular War, for years, was this thing that was always going on in the background, was always sucking resources and manpower, and frankly, attention from all of Napoleon's other affairs, and it would present a sort of constant problem. I believe the nickname that is sometimes used is the Peninsular War was Napoleon's bleeding ulcer. A little nasty, but it sort of describes what's going on. It's this thing that's constantly there, maybe isn't the most immediate problem, but is causing him constant pain.
Peninsular War. These are the voices of witnesses to those momentous days.
Great. I like the concept.
In the spring of 1808, French troops, posing as Spain's allies, occupied many Spanish cities by stealth. But as it became clear Napoleon intended to depose the Spanish royal family, opposition mounted. In Madrid, on the 2nd of May...
Yeah, well, Napoleon sort of got started, because France and Spain had been allies at times during this conflict, and Napoleon sort of got started by interfering with Spanish dynastic politics, and then, as we'll see, just crowning his brother King of Spain. So, he kept it close in the family, right? And, that off and on alliance between France and Spain, and it will be off for, the rest of the war. That's what we're going to see here. But part of that is because Portugal had been a long-time ally of the United Kingdom, right? Portugal and Britain were very much linked economically, diplomatically especially. They had a strong diplomatic relationship. And so that posed sort of a threat both to Spain and to France. Spain and Portugal, they've had some issues over the years, and of course, France's main rival was Britain. And so, there sort of presented an opportunity for alliance between Spain and France, which at times was taken, but that is very much falling apart right in front of us.
A tense situation between locals and French troops exploded into violence. The famous Dos de Mayo. A local priest witnessed the uprising.
Blind with the rage and fury, some fired on the French from windows and street corners.
A new voice actor.
Others flung themselves on their very ranks. Still others hurled stones, pieces of furniture and pots and pans from the balconies, where they were joined by women armed with cauldrons of boiling water. It really seemed as if there was not a single person who did not want to water the streets with French blood.
Damn.
Even at the cost of their own.
For all its fame...
I will say, just one thing. It put the name of the person, I believe who they were, like their occupation. I wish the sort of full citation was listed there. Individual, where the information was found, the date, where it was recorded, published. I think it's good practice to put a full citation in the video itself. I'm sure they're in the description, but, I'm always about making history more accessible and clear. So it would be nice if that full citation was in the video. But that is, that is sort of a minor thing in the grand scheme, especially if I'm presuming I'm assuming that all of these are the sources that were used. Yeah, it looks like it. If you, I mean, you can sort of see part of the issue here is that we're talking about individual accounts, and it might be a little challenging to go through and find the individual accounts in some of these whole books, right? This is Peninsular Eyewitnesses. This would appear to be sort of a book of primary sources, perhaps. I'm not familiar with it. And so we sort of have to track down where each account came from. If you put the citation in the video, you would say, here's the source, we got it from this book, this page to this page, and it would just make it more accessible, easier to find, right? That's why we do it in sort of academic papers. It's so when you're looking to find something, you can trace the path that the author used and more easily find the sources they're relying on. Now, this is still good, right? They're saying who said each thing, they're relying on these primary sources, and we've got stuff listed in the description, but I think the standards of practice could be a little higher. That's my critique.
French losses in this revolt were only 31 dead and 114 wounded. But stern French reprisals saw around 300 Spanish prisoners shot and set the tone for a war that was to be fought to the knife, with terrible cruelty on both sides. As Napoleon announced that his brother Joseph would be the new King of Spain, fighting spread across the country. At Zaragoza, Spanish soldiers and civilians joined forces to defend the city against the French.
About 1 o'clock, the French troops approached the city, whereupon we immediately opened fire on them. This was accompanied by a display of valor on the part of the inhabitants that has few equals. Seeing that the French were inside the walls, they rushed to confront them, with no other protection than their own noble breasts, and forced them to retreat in a hail of fire.
Captain Joseph
And one of the unique things about this conflict is that this is where we get the term guerrilla war or guerrilla war. Not because this is the first time that, guerrilla tactics were ever used. I mean, you can look throughout history to find what we might label as guerrilla warfare, but it was such a prominent and wide-scale example. This war was very much characterized. There was sort of standard engagements between two armies, but it was very much characterized by the people, people who had been civilians rising up, forming militias, arming themselves, and fighting back in a very piecemeal fashion against the French, across the entire country. We have a lot of material on guerrilla war now. It's been defined for a while. There's been a lot of writing on it. We see a lot of the things that would come to characterize guerrilla war here. For example, the French can hold the cities sort of relatively easily. I'm not going to say easily, there were a lot of problems, but the countryside is where the real issue is. The French soldiers get constantly attacked in the countryside. They're trying to deliver supplies or march some troops. They're getting sort of surprise attacked by civilians, guerrillas who know the area and know how to get the jump on the soldiers who are much better armed and typically better organized. So that is one of the very sort of notable aspects of this conflict.
Jaruzelski was a Polish officer serving in Napoleon's army and took part in the assault.
And of course, there were a fair number of Polish soldiers in Napoleon's army because think about the history of Poland in this era. Not too, a couple years, not too many years before Napoleon enters the scene, Poland had ceased to exist as a country. It had been carved up by its neighbors, Austria, Prussia, and Russia. They had taken all of Poland's territory in a series of partitions in the sort of mid to late 18th century. And Napoleon had essentially given Poland a chance to be an independent country again. He had created a new Poland. Now, it wasn't really independent. It was essentially sort of a French vassal state or sister republic, whatever you want to call it, right? There's a sort of a spectrum here, but, you know, the Poles who had lost their country fairly recently were being essentially given an opportunity to fight alongside the French for another Poland. And so you'll see a lot of Poles who are involved in Napoleon's Grand Armée. Not to mention that sort of the cause of Poland had been a bit of a cause célèbre, had been a bit of a liberal cause throughout Europe previous to this. So you had seen a lot of Poles in the sort of liberal quarters of Europe involving themselves in political movements and revolutions and such. So they're a part of this.
A bloody fight began, and the defenders of Zaragoza for the
Oh wow, I love all the different voice actors we're bringing in. That's great.
first time saw their enemies checked. This cheered them, and whole mobs of them now began to rush towards the gate. Crowding into the houses that overlooked it, they opened fire from the windows and roofs on our men, who could not see them, to fire back. With a hail of fire crisscrossing our columns from all directions, General Lefebvre recognized the need to fall back from the walls of the city.
Yeah, I mean, look, frankly, throughout history, then and today, urban warfare has been one of the most brutal sort of styles of combat. You know, extremely brutal, extremely bloody, extremely hard fought. You know, you take every inch through blood and sweat and gunpowder. That was very evident in the Napoleonic Wars. Whenever you see urban warfare happening, it's always very brutal. Yeah.
And gave the order to retreat.
The people were in great confusion, but this in no way interfered with the unmatched heroism they displayed. This was especially true of the women, who from the very beginning kept the defenders supplied with water, wine, and brandy, and mingling among their ranks, reanimated their spirits, and helped them to defeat an enemy who was as daring as he was ferocious.
Yeah, well, it's kind of an all-hands-on-deck type situation, you know? Everyone's getting involved to try and defend their homes, and we mean everyone. If you could contribute, you were probably out there contributing in whatever way you could.
The destruction that we suffered was very great.
That summer, Napoleon's most stubborn enemy, Britain, sent forces to aid Spain and Portugal, which the French had also invaded. In July, around 14,000 British troops landed at Mondego Bay. Among them, Private Harris of the 95th Rifle.
And there was, you know, a bit of tension between the British and their allies. You know, the Spanish, of course, but even the Portuguese. They had been friends for a while. The British, sometimes they don't work well with others. You know, they are a very sort of singular nation. They like to do things their own way. And so there was a bit of tension among the commands of these different forces. But, you know, the Brits had come to help. You know, they had come to fight on the side of the Portuguese. And now the Spanish, who had been embroiled in war with the French.
Rifles, thrust into action at Rolisa just days after disembarking.
The Rifles indeed fought well this day, and we lost many men. Joseph Colquhoun was by my side, loading and firing very industriously. Thirsting with heat and action, he lifted his canteen to his mouth. "Here's to you, old boy," he said, as he took a pull at its contents. As he did so, a bullet went through the canteen, perforating his brain, killed him in a moment.
Jesus.
Another man fell close to him almost immediately, struck by a ball in the thigh. Indeed, we caught it severely just here. I saw a man named Simmons struck
I love the sort of common man soldier accent.
full in the face by a round shot, and he came to the ground a headless trunk.
I'm also reminded of, I'm just thinking about Spanish history more broadly. You know, the sort of, the time Spain was having and was going to have, right? So you have, 1808 to 1814, this brutal and bloody war happening throughout the Iberian Peninsula. I want to keep Portugal included, even though I'm focusing on Spain here. Fast forward through the next more than a century, and Spain is going to have significant, political chaos, warfare, infighting, of course, sort of culminating in a bit more than 100 years later in the Spanish Civil War, which was an extremely bloody civil war between, broadly, sort of a democratic side and a non-democratic side, but, in the end, Francisco Franco, a fascist, won out, defeating a front comprised of sort of liberals, communists, anarchists. It's a really fascinating conflict. You should read George Orwell's Homage to Catalonia if you're interested. It's a fascinating first-hand account talking about primary sources. That's a great one to read. But, and of course, following that conflict, Spain would be under a fascist dictatorship for decades to come. So Spain's, not having a great time from especially this point onwards. There's a lot of infighting and war and conflict and repression. Of course, war externally, that's what we're seeing here, a French invasion, and war internally.
British and French regiments were accompanied by a number of women who provided services from laundry to nursing, and often married men in the regiment. They knew any battle might bring dreaded news.
When the roll was called after the battle, the females who missed their husbands came along the front of the line to inquire of the survivors whether they knew anything about them.
Yikes.
Amongst other names, I heard that of Colquhoun called in a female voice, without being replied to. As I looked at the poor sobbing creature before me, I felt unable to tell her of his death.
For all the horrors of battle, it was the ferocity of Spanish and Portuguese partisans that alarmed French soldiers most.
Yeah.
French convoys and messengers were particularly vulnerable to ambush by these guerrilla fighters, and never traveled without an escort.
Hey, thinking of the parallels, the French are facing Spanish guerrilla fighters here. The Spanish will be facing... They'll face traditional armies in Latin America of rebels, but they'll also face a fair number of guerrilla and sort of non-traditional fighters who will, very much frighten and defeat them when the Spanish try to put down the rebellions in Latin America. So, sort of... I don't know what point I'm trying to make there, but the Spanish are dealing it out to the French, and in short order, it's going to be dealt out to the Spanish.
Captain Marbeau was one such messenger, sent out at night with urgent dispatches.
The officer commanding our advance guard gave me a troop horse and 2 orderlies, and I went on my way in brilliant moonlight. When we had gone 2 or 3 leagues, we heard several musket shots, and bullets whistled close past us.
Yeah, you do not want to be a lone messenger or a small group of Frenchmen, galloping through the Spanish countryside in this era. There's a good chance you were going to be jumped and killed.
We could not see the marksmen, who were hidden among the rocks.
But the most terrifying fate was to be taken alive by the guerrillas.
Oh God.
A little further on, we found the corpses of 2 French soldiers, recently killed. They were entirely stripped, but their shackles were near them. Some little distance further, we saw a horrible sight. A young officer of the 10th, still wearing his uniform, was nailed by his hands and feet, head downwards, to a barn door. A small fire had been lit beneath him.
Horrible.
Happily, his torches had been ended by death. But as the blood was still flowing from his wounds, it was clear the murderers were not far off.
Such sickening discoveries led to savage French reprisals, fueling a cycle of atrocities by both sides.
a few grenadiers, and a woman canteen keeper.
Yeah, I mean, it's that, sort of cycle of violence where the French have invaded Spain, this country, and the people are frightened and furious and willing to perform these acts of violence against the French invaders. And of course, a lot of the French invaders are not so scrupulous themselves. But, you commit these atrocities against any lone French soldier you find. What happens? Well, the regiment finds them. They grow outraged, and they commit themselves to brutally murdering any Spanish soldiers, guerrillas, or oftentimes civilians that they come across. And as you can imagine, this cycle keeps going round and round, and the violence keeps ramping up.
Having dropped behind, stopped in a village to pass the night. Next day, they were given a guide who led them into a prepared ambush. There, their throats were all cut, with refinements of cruelty. The commandant of the battalion, informed of this horrible ambush, marched on the village, had it burned to the ground, seized all the able-bodied men, and announced he would have them all put to death if they did not point out the murderers.
And now we're getting to another feature that we often see with guerrilla warfare, or I should say the force fighting against guerrilla warfare, or you might call it counter-insurgency. This sort of brutality where you're dealing with an insurgency or guerrilla warfare. The whole deal is that a lot of these civilians have essentially mobilized themselves to fight back. Now, that makes it pretty unclear who is enemy and who is a civilian, right? You're not necessarily dealing with large standardized armies. A pretty obvious comparison is to something like the Vietnam War, where the American military was dealing with the Viet Cong, and they would go to villages and they would just murder, countless civilians, many of them innocent civilians who were not insurgents. But the sort of excuse is that, we can't tell the difference between an insurgent and a civilian. And so you can shoot them all down, or you can do something like this where you are coercing the civilians in whatever way by burning their homes down, taking their food, coercing them into, outing whoever the guerrillas are, right? I mean, it's a very, very brutal style of warfare.
4 refused to confess and were shot.
Right.
But the 5th revealed the assassins. They were present. They were shot.
All the elite companies were got together. The aim was to drive off the brigands who from time to time raided our lines and cut us off from every supply of food. We found the brigands barricaded in a little town called Alcanes. After a sharp fight, we got into the place and it was given over to us for pillage. Having murdered everyone and looted everything in sight, we stayed on for another 6 weeks. The brigands attacked us several times, but they could achieve nothing. However, whenever they caught someone from our side, they subjected him to martyrdom. Their tongues and nails were torn out, and then they were roasted alive.
Jesus. Yeah, we're definitely heading into or in this sort of era of mass mobilization here, where, as I said, guerrilla tactics had been a feature of warfare throughout history, but with sort of mass mobilization, they become more common. And also, the sort of recognition and labeling of guerrilla warfare allows people to study it and implement it. So you have, conflicts like, the Vietnam War or the Cuban Revolution, where these insurgents are actively implementing guerrilla war, that style. And in this era, sort of the early 1800s, late 1700s, we see, mass mobilization within standard armies, such as, the, armies of the French Republic. During Napoleon's era and before Napoleon's era, we see when the French Revolutionary Wars begin, one of the things that gives France a leg up is that so many people mobilize. In part, there is a patriotism there and a belief, and then of course we also get mass conscription. But, you know, especially in those early days of the French Revolutionary Wars, a lot of their enemies were shocked by sort of the enthusiasm the French soldiers brought to the conflict. They really believed in what they were doing. And of course, you also have sort of mass mobilization on a sort of less standardized way. Here, guerrilla fighters. You can think of another prominent example that has recently ended at this time is the Haitian Revolution, right? Think of the Haitian Revolution. That was essentially a extremely large number of enslaved people who, you know, freed themselves, mobilized, and organized, right? And it was this sort of mass movement, this warfare of a large number of people who organized themselves and were able to fight off their slave masters and oppressors. So that's, you know, another example, a little sort of maybe less connected than this to the French Revolutionary Wars or the Napoleonic Wars, but we can see this was absolutely an era of sort of revolution, uprising, mass movements, mass warfare.
In 1809, one British naval officer watched from his ship as French troops sacked the Spanish town of Corcubillon.
We observed the French soldiers pouring into the wretched town from both sides of the valley. Many of the inhabitants rushed to the fishing boats on the beach and, leaping into them indiscriminately, pushed into the stream. As we rowed up the harbour, we met hundreds of these poor people, half-dressed, screaming, and struggling hard to get beyond the reach of shot. Others fled along the sides of the hills towards the bay, hoping to be picked off the shore by boats or to conceal themselves amongst the rocks. Of these fugitives, great numbers were brought down by the fire of the enemy. So completely hemmed in were these wretched people that escape is almost impossible. The horror and confusion of this frightful spectacle were increased by the conflagration of the town, in the streets of which deeds of still greater atrocity were going on.
Brutal scene, but I feel right at home with that accent.
The war in Spain had begun disastrously for the French.
True.
They faced unexpected and ferocious resistance across the country, forcing Napoleon to intervene personally with massive reinforcements. The Spanish armies were defeated. Their British allies scrambled to escape.
Yeah, I mean, like I said, this is very different than the Haitian Revolution, but I don't know if the French and or Napoleon really learned many lessons about, you know, colonizing people or sort of brutally ruling over them or, you know, any of those kinds of things. And of course, the Haitian example was far more extreme. They were literally enslaved in this brutal system. And of course, Napoleon tried to reconquer and re-enslave them. I guess, you know, there's the you know, Hades or Saint-Domingue, the colony's longer history of brutal enslavement. But if we talk about Napoleon's role in particular, Napoleon tried to re-enslave the people. It seems like he didn't really learn his lesson. Hey man, people don't love being conquered and, you know, controlled. Whether that be to the furthest extent, which is re-enslavement, or even an example like this, which is less extreme, but still, you invade them, you take over their government, you know, you bring in a new style of government. Yeah, people don't necessarily love that kind of thing.
Beginning a desperate winter retreat through the mountains towards the port city of Corunna.
It became everyone for himself. The load we carried was too great, and we staggered on, looking neither to the right nor the left. If a man dropped, he found it no easy matter to get up again, unless his companion assisted him, and many died of fatigue.
Damn.
As for myself, I was nearly floored by this march, and on reaching a town one night, which I think was called Zamora, I fell at the entrance of the first street we came to. The sight left my eyes, my brain reeled, and I came down like a dead man. The enemy, I should think, were at this time frequently close upon our trail, and I thought at times I heard their trumpets come down the wind as we marched. Towards the dusk of the evening of this day, I remember passing a man and woman lying clasped in each other's arms and dying in the snow. I knew them both, but it was impossible to help them.
British forces did manage to escape by sea, despite heavy losses.
Classic British move, hemmed in, escape by sea. Also, I mean, that image, or not the literal image, but the picture that was painted, is so brutal. I mean, one of the good things about reading these primary sources, from the people that were there, you can get a look into the experience, and you've got this march that's so brutal that people are dying, not just from, being shot or disease, but they are so fatigued, they are falling by the side of the road, and unless someone else is able to help them up, they're just going to lay down and die. I mean, it's horrible. This is also, speaking on those primary sources, and I say this sort of frequently, when you deal with, say, ancient history, you're oftentimes dealing with a very small selection of sources. It's kind of the opposite when we get to more modern history. Sometimes you don't have enough sources. Sometimes you may have too many that you have a hard time going through them all. But, I'm the type of guy that too many sources is a good problem to have. I will go through them all. I love that kind of thing. But I really like having, this is an era where literacy rates are going up. They are relatively quite a bit higher than they had been in the past. You have a lot of people who can read and write, and read and write quite well, and a lot of people who are writing down their experiences, whether in journals or after the fact or in letters or whatever. And so, this is still an era, and a lot of history, we do rely on fairly elite and sort of sources from high levels of society, but we do have access to a lot of sources from ordinary people, civilians, ordinary soldiers, and that really brings a wealth of knowledge and experience with it.
And later that year, under the command of the future Duke of Wellington, they joined forces with the Spanish and defeated the French in battle at Talavera. Lieutenant Simmons of the 95th Rifles missed the battle, but saw its grim aftermath.
The horrid sights were beyond anything I could have imagined. Thousands dead and dying.
They whipped out the posh accent.
In every direction. Horses, men, French and English, in whole lines who had cut each other down. And, I'm sorry to say, the Spaniards butchering the wounded Frenchmen at every opportunity and stripping them naked, which gave admission to the attacks of myriads of pernicious flies and the heat of a burning sun.
I wonder how sorry to say he actually was. Just a thought.
The fate of captured soldiers in a country where all armies were continually short of water and supplies could also be dire. Spanish private Juan Manuel Sarasa was taken prisoner near Badajoz in 1811.
It would have been difficult to conduct the journey in a worse manner. It really seemed as if they wanted to starve us to death. When we set out each morning, we left behind the bodies of friends and comrades who had died in the night.
I mean, this is, there were sort of some international, what you might call international standards for this sort of thing, for keeping prisoners. Those standards were not what they would be in the future. And it was especially difficult for armies to keep large numbers of POWs with them, even if they did care to take care of them, which sometimes they didn't. This is why, we see a lot of, especially if you're an officer of some sort, a lot of officers who have been captured being paroled, allowed to return to their original countries, because oftentimes the armies or the countries that had taken these people prisoner simply did not have the resources to keep them around, and so would instead parole them.
Meanwhile, from the rear of the column, alas, there would come a constant rattle of shots. It was the French, finishing off the poor men who could not drag themselves along any further.
Jesus.
Reduced to mere specters, we did our best to help one another along. For to fall behind meant certain death.
I mean, that shows you how bad the conditions were, which is you've got, the most motivation you can pushing you forward, which is if you fall behind, you will be shot. And yet some people still do fall behind. That shows you how desperate and fatigued and tired and hungry they were, that even with that knowledge, some people couldn't drag themselves forward. That's how terrible the situation, the condition was.
But one by one, we were forced to abandon our friends and bid them farewell forever.
Just a few months into the war, Napoleon left Spain, never to return. As he occupied himself with affairs in Central Europe and his plans to invade Russia, French forces in Spain were left badly neglected.
Yeah, now, the Peninsular War was one of those things where Napoleon turns his attention away because, frankly, he's got bigger fish to fry. So the war goes neglected, but still draws resources and manpower. Though Napoleon needs those resources and manpower. So it's this sort of situation where the war, it's only hurting Napoleon, If he really wanted to prosecute this conflict, he would need to commit more to it. His attention, his men, his resources. He doesn't want to do that. Perhaps he can't do that because he's had the great idea to invade Russia. And so it's just left lingering in the background. And, this is a sort of common theme of the Napoleonic Wars. When Napoleon is present, the French tend to win. Not always, especially at the end. Of course, Napoleon is defeated. He didn't have a 100% win rate. But, like I said, when Napoleon was there, the French tended to win. You had a pretty good chance of winning with Napoleon in charge. When Napoleon left, the French chance of victory dropped precipitously. So Napoleon was able to show up, set his affairs in order, win a couple battles, but when he left, things started to really deteriorate.
It was a sorry situation for proud soldiers of the Grande Armée, such as Colonel Noël, who in 1811 was part of Marshal Massena's retreat from Portugal.
Our supply situation was deplorable.
This was, Massena, who was someone who had a long and fruitful career. Even before Napoleon, he had a career of his own. Yeah, things were not going great for old Massena. They really weren't.
Everything. Food, clothing, boots, money, and horses. 6 months of deprivation in a country without any supplies, and depending on marauding to live, had not listened the army's courage, but had exhausted it, and destroyed its discipline. We had left sad memories behind us with the Portuguese, and they would curse the name of France for a long while.
Yeah.
Survival had been necessary, it is true, but bad soldiers had behaved like brigands towards the unfortunate peasantry.
Yeah, there's a couple things at play here. One, there is just sort of naked brutality that resulted from, in part, you always have some soldiers who are willing to commit that, some soldiers who, in particular, dislike the population of whatever country you're in at the moment, who have some vengeance in their heart, and of course you have that cycle of violence that we talked about earlier, where things kept ramping up, and, the guerrilla fighters got more and more violent and brutal, and so did the French soldiers, so you have that. And then alongside that, and these are intermingled, you have the French, with Napoleon gone, growing desperate, lacking supplies, lacking the manpower and resources they need, and so resorting to marauding, stealing, looting, and that's also not helping their case with the Spanish civilians and the Spanish fighters. Not to mention, and this depended who you were serving under, but there was often not a great deal of discipline at play. Some of the marshals didn't make a great name for themselves here. Some of the marshals didn't seem to care that much. Some did. There was a lot of looting among the French marshals and the officer corps. So the discipline overall wasn't super high in the first place, and when things start getting bad, that discipline drops even further.
If, in their turn, the Portuguese showed themselves to be savage toward our prisoners and wounded, this can be understood, although not excused. The failure of this campaign in Portugal has been blamed on the commanding general. This is quite wrong. The responsibility must lie with Napoleon, who alone wanted this war and forced it upon his generals without giving them the means of ensuring success.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's essentially a fair analysis. Now, of course, anyone who's there doesn't want to take responsibility on their own shoulders. And like I said, this was not the finest moment for a lot of Napoleon's men. This wasn't Massena's finest moment. But I essentially agree that they've been left with a bad situation. Napoleon turned his attention away, turned his back on them, really. And, I mean, I think that's right. They didn't have the means of ensuring success. The conditions weren't right. And so things went badly. Maybe if, some of the officer corps or the marshals had led better, things could have gone differently. But remember, none of them were Napoleon, right? And so, yeah, essentially, I think that's true. I think Napoleon did not leave them in a great situation, and he didn't leave them with what they needed to succeed. Although, frankly, what they needed to succeed probably would have been Napoleon staying and finishing the war. Leaving the war to drag on for years, it was not the right move. Absolutely wasn't. It was a big mistake from Napoleon.
Yet despite their retreat from Portugal, the French would continue to fight tenaciously in Spain, as the British discovered the following year when they attacked the fortified city of Badajoz.
On our arriving at the breach, the French sentry on the wall cried out, "Who comes there?" 3 times, or words to that effect in his own language. On no answer being given, a shower of shot, canister and grape together with fireballs was hurled at random among us. I myself received 2 small slug shots in my left knee and a musket shot in my side, which must have been mortal had it not been for my canteen.
Damn.
For the bolt penetrated that and passed out, making 2 holes in it and then entered my side slightly. Still, I stuck to my ladder and got into the entrenchment. Numbers had by this time fallen, but the cry from our commanders being, "Come on, my lads!" We hastened to the breach, but there, to our great surprise and discouragement, we found the chevaux de frise had been fixed and a deep entrenchment made, from behind which the garrison opened a deadly fire on us. Vain attempts were made to remove this fearful obstacle, during which my left hand was dreadfully cut by one of the blades. But finding no success in that quarter, we were forced to retire for a time. My wounds were still bleeding, and I began to feel very weak. My comrades persuaded me to go to the rear, but this proved a task of great difficulty. I was so weak myself that I could scarcely walk, so I crawled on my hands and knees till I got out of reach of the enemy's musketry.
Yes, so you could imagine this is not a great condition to have open wounds, right? I mean, why did so many people catch diseases and have their wounds get infected? I mean, you can see right here why. Also, this man is clearly losing a lot of blood, and he's having to crawl his way to the rear of the line. You know, these are terrible conditions, right? Once again, you're seeing the life of a soldier in this era. The brutality of it right in front of you. The conditions, the terrible conditions.
We rushed forward to the breaches, where a most frightful scene of carnage was going on. The ditch was covered with dead and dying soldiers. If a man fell wounded, 10 to 1 that he ever rose again. For the volleys of musketry and grape shot that were incessantly poured upon us made our situation too horrid for description. I had seen some fighting, but nothing like this. We remained passively here to be slaughtered, as we could do the besieged little injury from the ditch.
The British assault on Badajoz did finally succeed. Its fall paved the way for Wellington's advance into Spain in 1812, where he met the French in battle at Salamanca. British morale was sky high.
There assuredly never was an army so anxious as ours was to be brought into action. They were a magnificent body of well-tried soldiers, highly equipped and in the highest health and spirits, with the most devoted confidence in their leader, and an invincible confidence in themselves.
When the British advance began, that confidence was soon put to the test.
A craggy ridge on which the French infantry were drawn up rose so abruptly that they could fire 4 or 5 deep. The fire of musketry was by far the heaviest I have ever experienced, and was accompanied by constant discharges of grape. An uninterrupted blaze was then maintained so that the crest of the hills seemed to be one long streak of flame. At the very first volley that we received, about 80 men of the right rear of my regiment fell to the rear in one group. The commanding officer immediately rode up to know the cause, and found that they were all wounded.
The enemy's shot and shell were now making dreadful havoc. A Portuguese cadet who was attached to our regiment received a shell in the center of his body, which, bursting at the same instant, literally blew him to pieces. Another poor fellow receiving a grape shot across his belly. His bowels protruded, and he was obliged to apply both his hands to the wound to keep them in.
That's my people, guys. It's my Scottish people. They're going through it. For those that don't know, I feel like if you've watched before, I talk about this a lot, but I am dual citizen, UK, US. I was born in Scotland. Always like to hear the Scottish accents in these videos. I'm feeling very, very represented. You know, we may not do that much American history, but we get some Scottish in there.
I shall never forget the expression of agony depicted in his countenance.
Brutal, though, as my people being brutalized. I hate to see it.
Salamanca was a great Allied victory. And though Wellington had to retreat back to the Portuguese frontier that winter, his next advance, in 1813, was decisive. The French abandoned southern Spain and Madrid, and retreated to Vitoria.
Wow. Yeah, I didn't know if how this video was going to be structured, by the way. I kind of thought it would be a little more kind of all over the place. You know, like we'd see just sort of a mix of different primary sources. But no, they're actually giving us the story of the Peninsular War, seemingly the whole thing, you know, sort of using these primary sources at the forefront. Yeah, I'm enjoying it. It's a great way to put together this narrative. Yeah, we're seeing the whole thing.
Here, King Joseph and Marshal Jourdan made their stand. But the Allied attack proved irresistible.
We advanced through the tumultuous scene with a battery in our front, dealing out dire destruction. Men and officers fell in every direction, and their wounds were most dreadful, being all inflicted with cannonballs or shells, except that of our colonel, who received a musket shot in his stomach. Our front had to contend with the French regiment on the right of the battery, But after politely receiving us with a few sharp volleys, which we as politely returned, they retreated into a thicket.
Okay.
Towards this, we advanced firing and drove them furiously.
I like the polite volleys. They're like, "Oh, you're here. Let us send a volley or two before retreating."
Before us, till they were completely routed.
I came across a poor wounded Frenchman crying to us English not to leave him as he was afraid of the bloodthirsty Spaniards. Poor fellow could not at most live more than 2 hours, as a cannonball had completely carried off both thighs.
Oh, God.
He entreated me to stay with him, but I only did so as long as I found it convenient. I saw that he could not last long, and very little sympathy could be expected from me then, so I ransacked his pockets and knapsack and found a piece of pork ready cooked and 3 or 4 pounds of bread, which I thought would be very acceptable. The poor fellow asked me to leave him a portion, so I cut off a piece of bread and meat and emptied the beans out of my haversack, which I left by his side. I then continued on my way up the hill.
I mean, it's brutal and horrible stuff, but everyone needs food, you know what I mean? And, God. I mean, that's a brutal story, though, you know? The Frenchman who's begging for him to stay, and he ransacks his pockets. Yikes. But yeah, like I said, this is brutal warfare, you know? You can see the perspective of the individual soldier. This is terrible stuff.
For soldiers on the losing side, the aftermath of battle could be a terrifying and uncertain time.
Yeah.
We retreated through a mass of wagons, horses, and overturned cannon which littered the field. I crossed a ditch that was completely filled with dead and wounded. 2 enemy cavalrymen came
I like all the different nationalities we're getting. We've got Johann now.
close to me, and as I could not fire...
You know, you know, like I said, I explained it with the Poles earlier, why they were there. This was a very... I mean, we know this was an international war, of course. It consumed Europe and beyond. But even within these different armies, it's not like, oh, we had the French army, it was just Frenchmen, or, you know, just, you know, whatever. These armies were not, you know, ethnically exclusive. Each of these different armies, you could find a collection of different nationalities. You could find units that were centered around different nationalities. And so you'll find a whole collection of different ethnicities and nationalities, even if, you know, we talked about the Poles. It's not like, the Polish army is here, but there were Poles involved. You know, there's a lot of different peoples involved in these battles.
With my wet ammunition, I put my musket over my shoulder and hung my head, awaiting my fate. But the cavalrymen went off to cut down some scattered Frenchmen on the field. Dusk fell, and I was at a loss as to which way to go. In the darkness, a whistle directed me to a nearby bush. I listened and heard French being spoken. Several soldiers from the 44th Regiment, belonging to our division, answered my call.
Wow.
For some
That's incredible luck. That's very unlikely.
Allied soldiers, the aftermath of Vitoria was the opportunity of a lifetime.
Yeah.
As King Joseph's entire treasury had been abandoned by the fleeing enemy.
Yeah.
About dusk, the head of our column came suddenly on some wagons. Someone called out, "There are money carts!" No sooner were the words uttered than the division broke, as if by word of command. And in an instant,
Yeah, I mean, looting was absolutely something that still occurred. We've seen plenty of looting in this video. Even, you know, the British Army was a very professionalized army for the time period. Even they could not completely prevent looting, especially in this situation, right? This is kind of for these soldiers the opportunity of a lifetime. This isn't just looting some town you've just ransacked. You know, this is the treasury that the French were dragging with them. This is an immense amount of wealth. So this is kind of exceptional, but you did see a lot of looting during this era. even though some more modern professional armies, as a lot of European armies were sort of becoming in this period, were perhaps trying to discourage it.
The covers disappeared from the wagons, and nothing was seen but a mass of inverted legs, while the arms were groping for dollars. For money, it certainly was. The scene was disgraceful, but at the same time ludicrous. I was sent to endeavour to clear one of these wagons, at which I at length succeeded. Not, however, until the money had disappeared, when to my surprise I discovered an officer at the bottom with his hands full of the precious metal.
By the way, they mentioned dollars. If any of you are thinking dollars, they're probably talking about Spanish silver dollars, right? You know, that was a very common currency, especially throughout the Americas in this, well, at this time, maybe a little less common, still very common, but sort of throughout the colonial era in the New World, the Spanish silver dollar and sort of Spanish currency broadly was very common.
I shall not mention either his name or his regiment.
Oh, okay.
Wellington's victory at Vitoria was the final, fatal blow to Napoleon's empire in Spain.
Yeah.
There was bitter fighting still to come at San Sebastian and in the Pyrenees. But French defeat was now assured. Within a few months, British, Spanish, and Portuguese troops would cross into France itself.
Yeah, well, at this point, you know, Napoleon is very much occupied. And not only is he occupied, but things have started going badly for the French. Of course, not just in Spain, but sort of broadly. So, this, frankly, never Napoleon's main concern, is now another army pushing into France itself.
The Peninsular War had been a long and bloody road.
Yeah.
Many thousands of lives had been lost on all sides. Some through violence, most from disease. Towns and villages had been laid waste. Cities and churches looted. Civilians massacred.
And when we talk about looting, we saw a lot of looting in this video. You know, soldiers looting towns and carts and whatever. But also, I mentioned earlier that some of the marshals or some of the officers were more about discipline, but a lot were willing to allow a lack of discipline and looting. And some of that looting, especially among that officer corps, the French officer corps, was of some pretty prize art and artifacts. You know, some pretty valuable stuff. And the French, by the way, they did this in a lot of places they went. You know, they did this in Italy, for example, as well. They would take expensive and sometimes famous artifacts, you know, all that kind of stuff. And they absolutely did that here.
The terrible effects of war were not quickly forgotten by the land, nor by those who lived through them. The Peninsular War was a calamity for Napoleon, in a career better known for its military triumphs. And if you want to see Napoleon near his peak in a desperate battle that pushed him to the limit, look no further than our next video, the Battle of Marengo. It's a clash that looms large in Napoleonic legend, but behind the myth lies a less flattering reality. So join us as we reconstruct Marengo hour by hour. This video isn't out on YouTube yet, but if you want to watch it now, you can head over to Prestige Streaming.
I always like to include whatever they've included.
They're released on YouTube, and know you're supporting the channel.
There you go. Go and check out Epic History's video. It's linked down below. You know, go and check out their Nebula, give them a like, all that good stuff. Show them support for making these excellent videos. And by the way, if you want to see my reactions to all of their Napoleon videos, I'll leave the link to that playlist down below. Alrighty. So, that was a good one. I really enjoyed that one. I've said this before, I said it in this video, I really appreciate the centering of primary sources. I really think that's what history is about. It's about engaging with those stories and experiences of individuals. And of course, how those can build to something greater. How through those we can understand historical trends and, change and continuity over time, all that sort of stuff. But I really appreciate when we put those primary sources at the forefront, as is being done here. Like I said, maybe my biggest critique was it would be really nice if they put the full citation on screen. And that's not something super major, but it is good practice, right? Because they're showing us who said these quotes, and who they were, like what their rank was. It would be great if they would just show us where they got the sources from, right? Which book it's from, which whatever, and what pages to find it on, right? That's really useful, because I know that on YouTube, maybe I'm asking for too much, right? This is mainly about entertainment. But, like I said, the reason you do this in sort of an academic article or book or whatever is so that if you yourself want to look through some of these sources, if you want to follow their research, do research of your own, it makes it much easier to follow if you know exactly where they got these quotes from, which book, which page, etc. And it'll let you do your own research. So I really like that, and I appreciate when people include that in their videos. And I think especially in a video so focused on primary sources, that would have been an excellent inclusion, and maybe something that they can do in the future. I don't think it would take, too much extra work, and I think it would be really great. But aside from that, I really enjoyed this video. I thought they did a great job including these primary sources and building this narrative and telling the story of the Peninsular War, centering these sources that they had. So yeah, I had a great time with this video. If you guys did, I'd appreciate it if you'd leave a like, subscribe, check out the Patreon, it's linked down below, all that good stuff. I hope you guys are all having a good day today, and I'll see you all again next time. Goodbye.